How I exposed my sister's affair with my husband and destroyed her life. I'm Leah, 35 years old, a marketing consultant and mother of two. You'd think I had everything together. My husband, David, was the perfect picture of a doting father, always so attentive to our girls, Lily and Claire, who are 8 and 6. We'd been married for 10 years, and, like most couples, we had our ups and downs. But cheating? No, that wasn't in my world. At least, not until Jenny got involved. Jenny, my younger sister, 29, a pediatric nurse, had always been the family sweetheart. Everyone adored her. The compassionate younger sister, always there for everyone. I looked out for her as much as I could. After all, she was my baby sister. I never thought she would. God, I never thought she would be the one to rip my life apart. It started innocently enough. David and Jenny had always gotten along. He'd joke with her at family dinners, she'd babysit the girls when we needed a night out. But I never thought much of it. Why would I? Who suspects their own sister of trying to ruin their marriage? The first clue came one afternoon about 2 months ago. David's phone had been acting up, so he asked me to check an email for him while he was in the shower. I didn't think much of it, and I was about to close out of the mail app when a message caught my eye. Last night was incredible. I can't wait to feel you again. Jay. My heart stopped. There was no mistaking who Jay was. Jenny, my sweet, perfect sister. My stomach twisted. A mix of anger, shock, and hurt overwhelmed me all at once. David, Jenny, I couldn't believe it. How could they betray me like this? I scrolled through the messages, each one stabbing me deeper than the last. Late night meetings, quick rendezvous when they thought I wasn't paying attention, and secret trips while I believed they were just running errands. They were crafty, but not careful enough. At first, I felt sick, literally sick. I barely made it to the bathroom before my breakfast came up. The bile burned as much as the betrayal. I wanted to scream, to confront David the moment he stepped out of the shower. But I didn't. I was too numb. I needed to process this. Besides, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a dramatic scene. No, I would play the long game. I had no idea how far I was willing to go then. Over the next few days, I watched them. Every touch, every look, every conversation between David and Jenny felt like poison. They thought they were being slick, but I saw through their charade. They weren't even trying to hide it from me anymore. That was the worst part, knowing that they had the audacity to carry on right in front of my face. Did they think I was that blind? That stupid? There was this one Sunday, we were having dinner at my parents' house. My mom, ever the overachiever in the kitchen, had made her famous lasagna. David was laughing at something Jenny said, and she, my own flesh and blood, was blushing like a schoolgirl. I watched them, eyes narrowing with every glance they exchanged. I was furious, and yet, I didn't say a word. Instead, I smiled, passed the garlic bread, and played the role of doting wife and loving sister. That night, lying next to David, my mind was racing. They thought I didn't know. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to explode or scream or throw things. That would give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No, I'd do something far better. I'd use their guilt against them. I'd make them live in their lies until they were suffocated by it. The idea was so outrageous, it almost made me smile. But first, I had to confirm everything. I needed concrete evidence. So, the next day, I called Jenny, asking if she could watch the girls while David and I went out for a romantic evening. She agreed eagerly, too eagerly, and I could practically hear the smugness in her voice. Did she think she was doing me a favor? Little did she know, I wasn't going anywhere with David. Instead, I followed her. I parked a block away from David's office and watched as Jenny's car pulled up. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, watching them through the glass doors. I felt like I was losing my mind, but it wasn't long before they confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't just meeting him, she was waiting for him. David emerged from the building, and there was no mistaking the look of desire on his face as he walked toward her. I didn't need to see more to know, but I stayed, watched them embrace, watched them leave, hand in hand, like some sick twisted couple out on a romantic date. It was my life, my family, and they were parading around like I didn't even exist. I clenched my jaw. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That night, I lay in bed next to David again, pretending everything was fine, while inside I was seething. The betrayal burned like acid in my veins, but instead of confronting him, I began plotting. I wasn't going to play the victim. No, I was going to make sure Jenny would regret every choice she made. I'd turn her guilt into a weapon. Make her suffer without ever raising my voice. They had no idea the storm that was about to hit. For days, I walked around in a fog of anger and disbelief. My husband, my sister, the two people I should have been able to trust more than anyone, had betrayed me in the most vile way. And yet, I hadn't confronted them. Not yet. Instead, I started planting the seeds for my revenge, playing the long game, watching them squirm under the weight of their guilt. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would discover next. I had convinced David and Jenny that life was normal, as though I hadn't uncovered their dirty little secret. But I knew, and it was driving me insane. The worst part, the casual way they carried on, like they weren't ripping my heart out piece by piece. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to be engrossed in some reality TV show, while David sat across the room on his laptop, typing away. The girls had already gone to bed, and Jenny was on her way over. She was coming by under the guise of catching up with me, but I knew what she was really there for. The tension in the room was suffocating, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. Jenny arrived, flashing that same sickeningly sweet smile she always wore. As we sat in the kitchen, sipping wine, I casually brought up how stressed David seemed lately, feigning concern. "I'm just worried about him, you know," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "He's been working late so often, he's barely around anymore." Jenny froze for a fraction of a second, and I caught it. She masked it quickly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Yeah, well, work's been hard for him lately. I'm sure he just needs a break." "Work's been hard for him? Oh, Jenny, you don't even know what's coming," I thought. I watched her squirm, enjoying how uncomfortable she was. But just as I was getting into the rhythm of manipulating the situation, she blurted out something that took the air out of my lungs. "I should tell you something, Leah," she began, her voice shaky, "before someone else does." My stomach flipped. She wasn't about to confess, was she? I stared at her, silently urging her to go on. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. Jenny took a deep breath, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't about to confess the affair with David. No, this was something else. Something darker. I'm pregnant. Pregnant. The word hung in the air like a noose tightening around my neck. It took a second for it to register, and when it did, my mind exploded. Jenny, my sister, pregnant. Before I could even process the shock, she kept talking. "Leah, I know what you're thinking, but I swear it's not what it looks like. I wasn't going to tell anyone this, but it's not David's. It's someone else's. This whole thing, it's all just one big mess." "Wait, what?" I blinked at her, my world spinning out of control. "Not David's, someone else's?" It felt like I had just stepped into some twisted soap opera where nothing made sense anymore. My anger turned into confusion, and I couldn't make sense of the madness unraveling in front of me. Who else was she cheating with? Who's the father? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. Jenny looked down, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "It's Dr. Marcus," she whispered, her words barely audible. "From the hospital. We've been seeing each other for a few months now." "Dr. Marcus?" The name hit me like a slap to the face. Dr. Marcus was one of the senior doctors at the hospital where Jenny worked, well respected, married with kids. I couldn't believe it. My sister was having an affair with two men, my husband and her married boss. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was an absolute catastrophe. Suddenly, everything clicked. The secrecy, the guilt, the odd behavior. Jenny had been juggling two affairs at once. And here I thought I was just dealing with a two-timing husband and a sister stealing him away from me. This was much bigger. Jenny stared at me, waiting for a reaction, but I just sat there, numb. I didn't even know how to feel anymore. Should I be relieved that David wasn't the father? Should I be outraged that she was cheating on multiple people? Should I laugh at the absurdity of the situation? No. What I felt most was opportunity. I could use this. I could twist this even further. Jenny was pregnant, and no one knew the truth, no one except me. This was a disaster waiting to happen for her. She didn't realize it yet, but I could use this little revelation to completely tear apart both her life and David's. I put on my best concerned face and reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Oh, Jenny, I can't believe this, but I'll help you," I whispered. Her eyes filled with relief, and for a second, I felt almost guilty. Almost. But then I remembered the betrayal, the countless nights they had spent together behind my back, laughing at my stupidity. No, I wouldn't feel guilty. Not for this. Jenny had just handed me the perfect weapon, and she didn't even know it. David had no idea his side chick was already playing another man. And Jenny? She was about to see just how deep the rabbit hole would go. I wasn't going to simply out them and explode in a dramatic confrontation. No, I was going to turn their lives into the same twisted wreck they had made mine. And this pregnancy? It was just the beginning of their unraveling. I hugged Jenny tight, knowing full well what my next move would be. The best revenge was still to come. I stood in front of the mirror that night, looking at my reflection, a wicked smile slowly curling at the corners of my lips. The plan was coming together, piece by piece. Jenny had no idea what she'd just handed me, a grenade disguised as a pregnancy. And David? He was blissfully ignorant, still tiptoeing around like a guilty schoolboy, clueless about the double life his mistress was living. The next morning, I texted my mother, Claire, 65, retired school teacher, and the queen of family gatherings. She loved hosting, bringing everyone together for these elaborate dinners and making a huge deal out of every birthday, anniversary, or even random Sunday lunch. If there was one person I could count on to make this public, it was her. "Hey, Mom," I typed, forcing my fingers to move calmly over the phone's keyboard. "I think it's time we had another family dinner. You know, something intimate, just the immediate family. Maybe this weekend?" Within minutes, she replied, brimming with enthusiasm. "Of course, darling. I've been meaning to get us all together. Is David free? I'll call Jenny too." Oh, I bet she would. I told her yes, and soon enough, the plan was set. A family dinner at Mom's house, David, me, Jenny, and Dad too. Dad, Frank, 68, was a no-nonsense ex-Marine. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened, and I needed all ears tuned in for what was about to happen. That week, I was a busy bee. I started seeding the guilt even further. At home, I ramped up the affectionate wife act. I made David's favorite meals, packed him lunch with little notes, and even sent him cheeky texts while he was at work, something I hadn't done in years. I watched him squirm, torn between guilt and the desire to keep up appearances. He wasn't sure what had changed in me, but I could see it in his eyes: fear. He thought maybe he was in the clear, that I had no idea about his affair. Oh, how wrong he was. Then, I went after Jenny. Knowing she was pregnant with another man's child gave me leverage, and I wasn't going to waste it. I began to hint that I knew something was off. Subtle comments like, "You've been glowing lately," or "You seem distracted, is everything okay?" would send her into a tailspin. She'd laugh it off nervously, but I could see her paranoia growing. She had no clue how much I actually knew. The day of the dinner arrived, and I could barely contain my excitement. The air felt electric, charged with tension only I could feel. David and I arrived first, of course. I'd made sure we were there early so we could settle in before Jenny showed up. Mom was in the kitchen, bustling around as usual, while Dad sat at the head of the table, reading the paper. Soon, Jenny walked in, and as expected, she had that nervous smile plastered on her face. Guilty, that's what she was, and tonight, I'd make her crack. But first, I needed a little more pressure. During dinner, I took every chance to bring up family. I talked about my parents' marriage. "How do you two keep it together after all these years?" I asked innocently, making sure both David and Jenny heard every word. Dad grunted something about loyalty and trust, and I could feel the heat rising between my husband and my sister. Jenny's eyes darted around the room, and I could see her biting her lip, avoiding eye contact with David. Perfect. The more uncomfortable they were, the better. My mother, oblivious to the brewing storm, chatted on about her garden and how she hoped for grandchildren soon. Grandchildren. The word hit the table like a hammer, and I watched Jenny's hand instinctively move to her stomach. I could see her swallow hard, her face pale. David, oblivious to Jenny's pregnancy, remained focused on his food, but I saw the flicker of panic cross her face. Now was my time to strike. "So, Jenny," I said sweetly, leaning forward, "have you thought about having kids? I mean, you've been with Dr. Marcus for so long now. Or are you two still keeping things casual?" The room went dead silent. Dead. My mother's fork clattered against her plate as she froze in mid-chew. Dad, sensing the shift in tone, looked up from his newspaper, frowning. David, however, was the picture of confusion. He stared at me, blinking. "Dr. Marcus?" David said, his voice tight with confusion. "Who's that?" Jenny shot me a look that could kill, her hands trembling as she reached for her water glass. "Oh, David, you don't know?" I asked, tilting my head in mock surprise. "Jenny didn't tell you she's been seeing someone?" "You know, Dr. Marcus, from her hospital. Lovely man, very accomplished." I smiled at her, my eyes gleaming with malice. "I hear he's going to be a father soon, too." Jenny's water glass slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. My mother gasped, covering her mouth in shock, while my father's face turned a deep shade of red. Now the fireworks were starting. David sat there, stunned, as the reality of what I'd just revealed began to sink in. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. Jenny, pregnant, with another man's child. It was as if I detonated a bomb in the middle of the table. "You're pregnant?" David's voice came out in a low growl, and he stared at Jenny like she was a stranger. Jenny, wide-eyed, stammered, "David, it's not what you think. I was going to tell you." "Tell him what, exactly?" I cut in, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "That you've been screwing around with your boss while also screwing my husband?" The room exploded. My mother started crying, Dad slammed his fists on the table, and David, oh, sweet David, looked like his world had just crumbled beneath him. Jenny tried to explain, but it was no use. The damage was done. David stood up so fast that his chair toppled over. "How long has this been going on?" David shouted, the veins in his neck bulging. Jenny's eyes darted between him and me, panic flooding her face. "David, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean?" I echoed, laughing coldly. "Oh, please, you didn't mean to sleep with him and get pregnant? That's rich, Jenny, really, it is." I sat back in my chair, watching as the chaos unfolded. This was what I had been waiting for. The guilt, the shame, the horror, it was all playing out right before my eyes, and I had orchestrated every moment of it. David, his face contorted with rage, stormed out of the house, leaving Jenny in a crumpled heap at the dinner table, sobbing into her hands. My mother was still crying, and my father looked like he might have a heart attack. I, however, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. I had set the stage perfectly, and now the pieces were falling exactly where I wanted them. But I wasn't done yet. No, this was only the beginning. Jenny's life was about to implode, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I watched David storm out of the house, his face twisted with betrayal, rage, and confusion. Jenny sat at the table sobbing, her makeup smeared and her once perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. My mother, still in shock, stood frozen in place, and my father sat in his chair, glaring at Jenny like he might lunge at her any second. The scene was chaos, but I felt calm. There was no rush, no panic, just the slow, methodical pleasure of watching the pieces of my plan fall exactly where I'd placed them. After a few moments of stunned silence, I stood up from the table, taking my time as I straightened my dress and walked over to Jenny. She looked up at me through tear-filled eyes, and I gave her a small, sympathetic smile. "Don't worry, sis," I said softly, leaning down to whisper in her ear. "I'm sure David will forgive you. After all, you're just a poor, misunderstood woman who made a mistake, right?" She flinched at my words, knowing full well that I was mocking her. Her guilt was written all over her face, and I knew exactly how to keep twisting that knife. I stepped back, glancing at my parents. "Mom, Dad, maybe we should give Jenny some space. It's a lot for her to process, you know." I smiled sweetly, pretending to be the compassionate, concerned sister, all while enjoying the way Jenny squirmed under the weight of her shame. My mother, still wiping her eyes, nodded weakly. "Yes, of course, Leah." Poor Jenny. I nearly laughed at how easily my mother fell into my trap. She was always the nurturing type, the one who believed in second chances and forgiveness. But not me. No, forgiveness wasn't part of my plan. After the disaster of a dinner, David went to stay at a friend's house. I knew he wouldn't want to face me right away, he'd need time to process the truth. Jenny, on the other hand, retreated to her apartment, a mess of emotions. This is where the real fun began. The next day, I sent David a text. "We need to talk. When you're ready, come home." Of course, I knew he'd come. David wasn't the type to run forever. His pride and guilt would draw him back, and when he returned, I'd be waiting with open arms. After all, I wasn't the villain here. I was the loving wife, the innocent victim in this whole sordid affair, and I was going to use that to my advantage. When he finally came home 2 days later, he looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hair was disheveled. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether to come in. I made it easy for him. "David," I said softly, walking toward him with a look of concern on my face. "I'm so sorry you had to find out like that. I had no idea Jenny was pregnant, and I certainly didn't know about Dr. Marcus." He looked at me, confused and heartbroken. "Leah, I don't even know what to say. I feel like I've been living a lie." I nodded sympathetically, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay. I know this is hard for you. I never wanted it to come out like this." He sat down heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "How could she do this to me? And you, how are you so calm?" I knelt down in front of him, forcing myself to look as gentle and understanding as possible. "David, I've had time to process, and right now my focus is on you. We'll get through this together. We've been through so much already." I could see the relief in his eyes. He wanted to believe me. He needed to believe that I was still the loving wife who would stand by him. But little did he know, my sympathy was nothing more than a carefully crafted mask. Over the next few days, I turned up the manipulation. I played the role of the perfect wife, comforting him, supporting him, making sure he knew how much I loved him. I cooked his favorite meals, we watched his favorite shows, and I even indulged in intimate moments, making him feel like he still had a stable, loving home. But behind every smile, every touch, every whispered reassurance, I was setting him up for the final blow. Jenny, of course, had no idea what was coming. She still thought she could slink away into her new life, pretending like none of this had ever happened. She was avoiding David and me, which suited me just fine. The more distance she put between us, the more vulnerable she became. I began dropping little hints to David, innocent-sounding remarks that planted seeds of doubt. It's strange, isn't it? How Jenny's been so distant lately. I wonder if she's feeling guilty about what happened. David's brow furrowed. I don't know, she hasn't been answering my calls. Maybe she's just ashamed. I nodded thoughtfully. Maybe, or maybe she's trying to cover something up. You know how secrets tend to pile up. He stared at me for a moment, suspicion creeping into his eyes. Perfect. The cracks were forming. The real revenge came at the next family gathering, a barbecue at my parents' house. By now, the tension between David and Jenny was palpable, but they were both still trying to act normal for the sake of appearances. My parents were blissfully unaware of the war brewing beneath the surface. I waited until we were all seated at the table, the sun setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I smiled as I watched David and Jenny avoid each other's gaze, the guilt eating them alive. And then I dropped the final bomb. You know, it's funny, I said, casually sipping my wine. I was talking to one of Jenny's co-workers the other day. Dr. Marcus, wasn't it, Jenny? He mentioned something about your little affair being more than just a fling. Jenny's face went white. David's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tight with anger. Oh, nothing, I said innocently. Just that it wasn't exactly a secret at her hospital. Apparently, it's been going on for quite some time. Isn't that right, Jenny? Jenny's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was trapped, and she knew it. David stood up, his fists clenched. How long has this been going on, Jenny? He demanded, his voice rising. How long have you been lying to me? Jenny stammered, trying to find an excuse, but it was too late. The damage was done. David exploded, shouting at her, accusing her of betraying him, of making him look like a fool in front of everyone. I sat back and watched as my carefully orchestrated plan unfolded. Jenny was in complete meltdown mode, and David was too furious to see straight. The family was in chaos, and I was the only one standing untouched in the eye of the storm. But I wasn't finished yet. I leaned over to Jenny, my voice low so only she could hear. I told you this wasn't over, didn't I? You're going to lose everything, Jenny. Your family, your lover, even your job, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Her eyes filled with tears, and I knew I had won. This was no longer about David or Jenny's affair. It was about me, about regaining control, about showing them both that I was stronger, smarter, and far more dangerous than they ever imagined. The revenge was complete, and the best part, neither of them even saw it coming. The aftermath of my carefully crafted revenge left a silence in its wake that was almost too sweet to describe. Jenny had fled from the barbecue that night in disgrace, a wreck of tears and humiliation, while David, consumed by his own rage and betrayal, followed her, throwing accusations that cut deeper than anything I could have ever said. I stood in the garden, watching the chaos I had ignited. My parents had no idea how to process what had just unfolded. Mom kept looking between me and the door, confused and distraught. Dad was silent, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Leah, my mother finally said, her voice trembling, What just happened? I turned to her with an expression of feigned sadness. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way, Mom, but Jenny, she's been lying to all of us. I tried to help her, to give her a chance to come clean, but she just kept hurting David, and us. I could see my mother processing my words, and as expected, the sympathy shifted from Jenny to me. How could it not? I was the faithful wife who had been blindsided, the loving sister who had tried to protect the family, only to be betrayed myself. The perfect victim. By the time I left my parents' house that night, I had everyone wrapped around my finger. My mother called me her rock, and my father, who rarely showed much emotion, gave me a stiff, reassuring hug as if I were the wounded party. I planted the seeds of their disappointment in Jenny, and it would only grow from here. The real victory came 2 weeks later. David, unable to reconcile his feelings, moved out of our house. He left me a note on the kitchen counter. Leah, I need some space to figure things out. I'm sorry. Of course, he was. Sorry for the lies. Sorry for the betrayal. Sorry for letting his lust for my sister ruin everything we had built. But by now, David's guilt was the least of my concerns. I had already won, and his absence only served to solidify my position as the wrong party. Jenny, on the other hand, was unraveling. Word of the affair spread through the family like wildfire, thanks to a few well-placed conversations on my part. I didn't even have to work that hard at it. People love to gossip, especially when the story involves scandal. She tried to apologize to me, of course. A text: Leah, I'm sorry. I don't know how this got so out of control. Can we talk? I never replied. Then, another: I never meant for this to happen. Please, I need to explain. I can't lose you too. Still, silence from me. The more I ignored her, the more desperate she became. She showed up at my door one afternoon, tear-streaked and broken, begging for my forgiveness. I remember standing in the doorway, looking down at her, my once perfect sister, now a pathetic shell of the person she used to be. Please, Leah, please. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Just tell me how to fix this. She choked on her words, her hands trembling. I crossed my arms, making no effort to hide my satisfaction. Fix it? There's nothing left to fix, Jenny. You ruined it. You ruined everything. I trusted you, and look at what you did. To me, to David, to our family. You're a disgrace. Her sobs intensified, but I felt nothing, just the cold, calculated satisfaction of knowing that I had stripped her of everything she held dear. Leah, please, she whimpered, don't push me away. You're my sister. I tilted my head, letting the silence between us hang heavy for a moment. No, Jenny, you lost the right to call me your sister the moment you decided to sleep with my husband. She crumpled on my doorstep, her body racked with sobs, but I just closed the door on her. The click of the lock felt like the final note of a symphony, a perfect ending to the chaos she had created. Months passed, and life slowly fell into place, just as I knew it would. David stayed away, and though there were moments when he tried to reach out, his messages grew less frequent as time went on. He was ashamed, too ashamed to face me, and too guilty to try and reconcile. I didn't care. His absence didn't bother me, and frankly, I had no intention of rebuilding what we once had. The damage was done, and while David was a pawn in my revenge, his role in my life was now over. I filed for divorce quietly, without much fanfare. The house was mine, of course. David didn't even contest it. He knew he had no ground to stand on, and I made sure to keep his affair with Jenny in the spotlight whenever necessary. Divorce proceedings were swift, and the settlement worked entirely in my favor. I was free. Jenny, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. The whispers about her betrayal never stopped. Our family slowly began to distance themselves from her, piece by piece. She moved to a smaller apartment across town, trying to escape the shame that followed her everywhere. Her career took a hit too. Dr. Marcus, her lover, was married, after all, and when word of their affair spread through the hospital, it didn't take long for his wife to demand repercussions. The fallout led to a suspension for Jenny and the eventual collapse of her professional life. She had nothing now, no career, no lover, no family, just the consequences of her own actions. Exactly as I had planned. And me, I flourished. With David gone, I rediscovered my independence. I threw myself into work, building my event planning business into a successful venture. People started talking about me in different circles, the strong, resilient woman who survived a betrayal and came out stronger on the other side. I received invitations to charity galas, offers to speak at women's empowerment events. I became a symbol of grace under pressure, and I loved every minute of it. But the best part? The satisfaction of knowing that, in the end, I won. I had orchestrated every step of Jenny's downfall, and no one ever suspected a thing. To the world, I was the wronged wife who had forgiven, the sister who had tried to keep the family together. No one knew the truth, that I had played them all, and that Jenny's destruction was the result of my own meticulous planning. It was poetic, really. She thought she could have everything: my husband, my life, my trust, and in the end, she was left with nothing. As for me, I had everything I wanted, everything I deserved. And Jenny? Well, Jenny would spend the rest of her life knowing that I was the one who orchestrated her fall from grace, and that knowledge, I'm sure, would haunt her forever.